Hi, this is Justin Colletti. You may know me from Sonic Scoop, but today I'm here with Plugin Alliance, and we are talking with an excellent mix engineer, a guy named George Seara. He's probably one of the biggest mixers based in Canada. He works with artists from all across the world and across genres. He's really notable for his work with Shawn Mendes. He's also worked with James Bay, Rihanna, Drake, Mos Def. The list goes on and on. So excited to have him here today. George, how are you doing?
Very well. How's it going?
Yeah, not too bad. Great to have you here with us. And our excuse to talk today is a new saturator that's coming out from Plugin Alliance under the line of Neold. This is the Neold Big Al. For those of you who don't know Neold, they're making some really interesting devices. They're kind of modeling analog hardware that would be impossible or ridiculous to make and market in the real world. This was the team that was behind the Phil's Cascade saturator from Alessia a while back. They've come out with some new ones now based on some old Telefunken designs, and this one, the Big Al, is based on some old Telefunken designs. Really interesting, unique saturator, and we have a great excuse to talk with George about the way that he approaches saturation in the mix. He does some tremendous work. I'm really looking forward to getting some insights from him. So right before we dive into it, George, you work in a kind of hybrid way. Looks like you have a console there in front of you. I believe it's an SSL there. You've got a nice, pretty rack of some analog gear, but obviously you're working on computers these days, and obviously you're working with a lot of plugins. How does, just right off the bat, plugins and digital technology integrate into this hybrid analog digital workflow of yours?
Yeah, that's a great question. I find that nowadays there's so many plugins all across the sessions that I receive, but I still find that just having an analog workflow where I can sum things up onto a console allows me a little bit more flexibility and just sort of quickness to sort of get ideas out and across quickly. But no doubt there are a lot of plugins involved in pretty much all the projects that I'm working on, unless it's like a jazz project or something like that.
Cool. I've also heard of you taking an approach where you've gone kind of outside of your main studio and worked in environments without a console, notably recently with Shawn Mendes. Can you tell us a little bit about what that approach is like when you're working without the console?
We worked on his most recent album, Wonder, throughout, much of last year. We naturally had to come up with a creative means to make everything work. And so it didn't require much change because we naturally find the most conducive way to record is to sort of set ourselves up in a sort of non-traditional recording environment. So it often involves setting up a remote studio in a sort of vibey, creative, off-the-grid kind of space. So I'll bring out some gear and we'll hire some equipment, and I'll still have maybe 24 channels of Neve preamps and lots of microphones. But the main goal is to set up a nice creative space where we can move from instrument to instrument, and we have a piano, maybe a few drum kits, various guitars, bass, vocal microphones set up around the room. And we don't really have any isolation from, let's say, the control room to the recording space. And so what happens is the sort of computer that we're recording to, we're based around Pro Tools, ends up being, a chair, a couple chairs next to the Pro Tools system, and that everyone's there's a close-knit team of creative collaborators with us. And we all sort of take turns sitting around the Pro Tools at times and having tools on hand that allow us to sort of quickly create create sounds that will influence and sort of inspire performances. We have to have those types of tools. And the Plugin Alliance, many of the plugins from, I'll start with just saying the BX console itself ends up providing great tone shaping, sculpting tools that are low on latency and DSP and sound great.
Very cool, very cool. So when you're working without a console, I imagine that plugins become an even more important thing to get some of that color that maybe you're not getting out of some of the console and some of the analog gear that you normally have access to. Could you tell us a little bit about your approach to saturation and how you end up using saturation as part of the mix? Are there particular elements that you use it on? Is it more of like an individual track thing or kind of more of like a bus by bus thing? What are your thoughts and approach to saturation as a tool more globally?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't necessarily have a formula for it, but I'll tell you that tools like this Neold plugin that we're speaking of today, it's just a great, think of it as a tone shaping tool. So if there's any instruments that right out of the gate, and you could almost try it on anything that you just think you quickly want to be able to provide maybe a little bit more fatness or vibe to a certain instrument. Think of it this way: it has a tone control, it has bass, it has treble, and it has gain that's feeding into this sort of tone saturation. So you can approach it obviously pretty heavy-handed, but you can also approach it pretty lightly and just softly. And it's amazing that even using it in broad strokes and just sort of lightly, it ends up being pretty addictive. It sounds good on a lot of instruments. I've been playing with it on bass. I've been playing with it on drums and various loops. You were asking, do I put it across the bus or the individual instrument? I mean, I love it directly on the bass. I love it with drums. I love it on the bus. I've been playing with it with synths. Basically anything that you would like to, it being a tone shaping tool, anything that you would like to not necessarily bring louder, but you would like to just fatten up a little bit and maybe possibly take the edge off even a little bit. It sounds really smooth, but you can also be really aggressive with it, but I think it sounds great.
Very cool. Now, how would you describe the characteristics of this particular one that we're talking about now, the Neold, compared to other saturators? Are there any adjectives that you'd use to describe this one compared to some other options out there in the palette?
Yeah, that's a good one too. I mean, I'm having the most success with it. To me, just saturation in general. Think of it not being necessarily as heavy-handed as distortion or overdrive. So I end up having, where I like it the most is sort of just using it, in smaller amounts. So I'm using it on the drums, but saturation just inherently tends to have a bit of a soft knee compression kind of sound to it. So if you don't hit it too hard. And the plugin itself, just so you know, it has a meter on it, and the meter, you can toggle it to show the input, the output, and some gain reduction. And so the idea is that the harder that you hit it, obviously what goes in is not necessarily going to come out. And so the harder that you hit it, it does break up and breaks up in a beautiful way. But to me, I find that, just hitting it like for a dB or two of soft saturation sounds amazing.
Very cool. Yeah, that's very uncommon in a saturator to see that kind of gain reduction meter. Anything else that's particularly unique about this one compared to other options that you have in your toolkit?
I would say just the plugs. Like it has some sort of like hot plugs on the left-hand side of it that allow you to quickly, go through various different types of tones. And so rather than just, using the knobs that are on the screen, you can sort of hot wire it a little bit and you can get pretty aggressive. It has a voltage sag plug that one in particular tends to really break up nicely if you want that sound.
Right, very cool. I'm excited to try it out myself. I've liked the past Neold stuff, and I've been a big fan of the Telefunken tools when I've encountered them in studios in the past. I'm used to ones from kind of much later. I think this one is modeled after components from like as early as the 1930s, so really kind of interesting, distinctive stuff. If I remember correctly, Neold pretty much built themselves their own new device out of some of these original tubes from some of these original Telefunken units and then modeled that new device. So it's a really kind of unique approach to making plugins, I think, rather than just modeling vintage gear we all know, creating new custom vintage gear that would be kind of impossible or too expensive to bring to people, and then modeling that. So really interesting take on this stuff. I'm curious to hear, George, before I let you get back to your busy day, if there are any other plugins in the Plugin Alliance family that you're a big fan of that tend to show up in your work again and again.
Well, BX Console is used frequently. I love the BX Console, particularly the 1000, the G or the E. I love the Townhouse
Oh, yeah.
compressor. That's amazing.
Hmm.
I mean, the SPL transient designer gets used a lot. The Mag
Yeah.
EQ, the Millennia EQ, the
Hmm.
NSEQ2, the Shadow Hills. So a lot of
Oh,
great
yeah.
plugins that get used a lot. There's another one that I actually really like is the Vertigo. I think it's the VSC2. It's a
Right.
it's
Yeah.
it's a great compressor as well and tends to have a nice snappy sound. So on things like drums, sounds great.
You're talking about some of my favorites as a mastering engineer where I wish my clients would have used an SSL bus compressor. I'm often grabbing the Townhouse. It's one of my favorite SSL style bus compressors. The Shadow Hills just has a tone even if you don't do anything with it. It's just some great tools there. I'm curious to hear, since you have an SSL console in front of you, but you also use the software version of the SSL console from Plugin Alliance, why do you sometimes grab that even though you have an SSL console in front of you there in your studio?
Well, interestingly enough, I'll say this because the mainstay of my work is mixing, that I receive sessions in different formats, but when they come in let's say Pro Tools, often there's plugins all over the sessions already. So I
Right.
tend to have a lot of plugins in my plugin library just so that the sessions will open up and play back properly. So I'll say right out of the gate, there are often a number of SSL style EQs and channel strips like the Plugin Alliance BX console all over it already. And when I also was speaking about being out with an artist like Shawn and working remotely, that we naturally like have the BX console almost on every channel as a starting plugin, just because having an EQ, having a compressor, gain and control like that with one insert and sounding as good as it sounds, it almost ends up getting used. It's almost in the first slot on every channel.
Right. Very cool. Well, there's so many more questions I could ask you. I feel like we could easily go another 45 minutes worth of questions I have for you, but we're just giving the people today a taste about the idea of using saturation thanks to this Neold. For those of you who want to check it out and try it out yourself, George has been enjoying it a lot. And you can check out plugin-alliance.com, where you can try out anything that Plugin Alliance makes for free. So check it out, plugin-alliance.com. This is a Neold Big Owl, really interesting saturator based on some old Telefunken circuits and tubes, a new kind of original recreation by the team at Neold. So definitely check it out. I'm excited to try it out myself. George, did you end up doing any presets on this one?
We did actually, so check them out. We did a number of presets. Hopefully people will find them as a great starting place for their own work.
Good stuff. What kinds of presets are people going to find from you when they pop open this plugin?
You know what? I gave some great drum presets, bass, keyboards preset. I think put in some synths preset, and even just an overall bus preset that I think will work remarkably well as a starting place for even an entire mix.
Nice. Yes. A little subtle saturation on the mix bus becomes increasingly important for people who are working in the box. So glad to hear that this is one of those options for it. So again, check it out, plugin-alliance.com. Try it out for free. Try out George's presets. And George, if people want to find you on the web, what are the best places for them to go catch up with what you're doing?
I'm on Instagram. People could find me there, or my website, georgeseara.com. Feel free to send me a note, and yeah.
Good stuff. George, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for making those presets for us to play around with. Thank you guys for hanging out with us. See you next time.